All right, well, why don't we get started here? The 9 a.m. session is always a little bit of a challenge in Las Vegas. At other conferences, it's kind of the prime slot, but out here, most people are still, I guess, out from the night before. But we're going to start the session. This session is how Yammer and SharePoint are approaching social. And what we wanted to do today is I just wanted to set a little bit of expectations about what we're going to talk about today. Because this is not going to be a very sort of technical, in-depth session or a session that's all about kind of covering features. If you look across the conference and the 300-plus sessions that we have here at the SharePoint conference, there's probably about 280 or 290 of them that fall into that category. But this is a session where we wanted to have someone from the Yammer side, someone from the SharePoint side, come up and talk a little bit about the approach that we're taking towards social, how we think it impacts your business and how it has a really positive impact on your business, and really kind of give you a sense of where we're going. Of course, we're going to talk a lot about features, and we'll be sort of walking through, but that'll be sort of in service of the larger goal, and the larger goal is really to give you a sense of how social will impact you over time. And so I'm Bill Morian. I work on the SharePoint team, and so I'll be kind of covering the second half of the presentation, but I'll let Jim kick off the presentation overall.
Thanks, Bill. Excuse me. Yeah, my name's Jim Patterson. I'm the head of product at Yammer. I've been there about almost 4 years, pretty much since the beginning of Yammer. And from the beginning, Yammer's had a pretty big mission. Our mission was to bring social networking to the enterprise in order to make employees and companies more open. Specifically, make companies more connected, companies more open and employees more connected. And what that means is, essentially we believe that companies that sort of work in the open, that do more of their work and have an open culture, are better, are able to communicate better. Employees that are more connected to each other and connected to the organization as a whole, to the goals and values of the company, are better. And just sort of fundamentally, we believe in this case of this open is better. And as we've been talking with the SharePoint team, we realized that we shared a lot of the same values, that this sort of open communication is a fundamental upgrade in the way people communicate. Really, when people talk about social, I feel what they're really talking about is this idea of openness. Ultimately, social isn't about profiles or feeds or following relationships. It's really about being able to communicate across the barriers that cause information to be siloed within an organization. In computer science, there's this well-known adage called Conway's Law. And basically what it says is that an organization that designs systems is constrained to produce designs that are copies of the internal communication structures of that organization. Now, in layman's terms, sort of you think about, a company that's going to build a computer compiler. If you break the team up into 3 different teams, you'll end up with a 3-stage compiler. In more general terms, it just means that the output of a company is truly defined by the way the employees internally communicate. I mean, it makes a lot of sense when you think about why companies are constantly going through reorganizations. Every time the world changes, what happens is the leadership of the company realizes that the company needs to move in a new direction, and in order to align everyone to go in that new direction, they have to actually change the structure of the organization to set up the new communication channels so that everyone can work together to go into the new direction. But we think being able to communicate more in the open, to break down a lot of these internal silos, will be able to help companies move faster and become more adaptable in an ever-changing, and increasingly changing world. Now, we do realize that in business, not everything can be completely open all the time. What really comes down to is it open by default? And another way to put that is the culture of your company based on a need-to-know principle or a not-need-to-know principle? So when you think about it, if you're creating a piece of content, creating a piece of information, is the systems and the culture around you such that you create it privately and then you have to share it out with all the people that you think should also know that information? That's called more of a need to know. Whereas the opposite, a need not to know, would be the information starts more open and you restrict it from people who don't have a need to know. It's a pretty subtle distinction, but it makes a huge difference when you think about the mindset that drives how information is shared in your organization. And most of the enterprise software that is brought into an organization reinforces a lot of that thinking. So for example, a closed system, like email, for example, is a closed system where you have to explicitly address every piece of content that you create. It puts the burden on the end user to be able to share out throughout the organization. And the problem is people only know who they know. So a closed system will always reinforce the silos that already exist, because I can't share information with someone who I don't know I don't know even exists. Now, there's many different types of silos in an organization. The most obvious is the traditional org structure. You take a big company like Microsoft, for example. At the top level, it's organized into a bunch of separate divisions. There's the Office division, the Windows division, Windows Phone, Entertainment, make Xbox. And in many ways, these divisions are run like almost completely separate companies. But the problem is they're not separate companies. It's one company. And there's a lot of synergies, actually, between all of these divisions. If you've seen a lot of the new products that Microsoft's been releasing over the past couple of months, there's a lot of overlap between what's going on in Windows and Phone and Xbox and Office. But in order to coordinate across all of these divisions, there has to be communication across all these divisions. And you can kind of see Conway's Law at work when you look at a lot of the products that companies like Microsoft and others produce. You can actually see the organizational structure represented in the products. A lot of times the seams you'll feel and the friction when you're trying a product will be the friction between two different organizations in the company. And so it manifests itself in the external output of these organizations. So this is what Yammer looked like 4 years ago. When we first launched, the core functionality of Yammer was pretty basic. It really was just a private Twitter for your organization. Every user had a single feed. They could post something to their feed, and then anyone who was following that user could see all of the posts of the people they follow in their feed. It was very simple, but from this core functionality, we built this sort of enterprise collaboration suite around it. But if you really break down the initial Yammer product, it was really the ability for someone to post something to no one in particular, and then have someone else, who they may or may not know, discover it, and for those two people to make a connection. That was basically the magic. It was being able to communicate across the silos that sort of separated people within an organization. So this could be someone asking a question where they didn't know who had the answer. It could be someone just sharing what they're working on and finding out someone else is working on something similar and then saving the duplicate work. Or even as simple as just posting an interesting link and having one of your colleagues like it. Just to know that what you're doing is sort of being seen and being appreciated by other people in your organization. But the point is, you could do all these things in Yammer, these small little use cases that simply weren't possible with the existing tools at the time. Because the existing tools just reinforced the existing silos because they weren't able to communicate across the barriers because they were closed by default. And because they were closed by default, you can't have discovery. So when we talk about making these serendipitous connections, it's very hard to have a serendipitous connection out of your inbox because everything in your inbox, presumably you've already seen, has been explicitly addressed to you. There's all kinds of other information out there in your organization that wasn't shared with you that if you could see it, would help you do a job, would help you make a connection, but you can't because the system, the way the information was created, is closed. So over time, Yammer's morphed into a much more full-fledged application. This is what Yammer looks like today. So we've added threaded conversations, a more algorithmic feed, the ability to send private messages, post photos, documents, and probably one of the most important features is Yammer groups. And that's the ability to post a message into a group inside Yammer, which allows you to share a piece of information with a specific context. So up here is an example of a group. It's the design group. So you can look at the header, you see, the group has a name, but it's important that this group is a public group. So, normally you would think about groups. Groups naturally become silos. So a lot of products have the concept of groups or sites, and people create them and put their information in them. But what happens is, because only the members of that group can see the content posted to that group, the groups themselves become silos and end up doing that same reinforcement that other closed systems have. But an interesting concept of a public group, the ability to join a group, but then other people who aren't members of that group can find information. So if you see here, there's somebody posted, so Jenny here is sharing a banner that she's been working on. She just posted that to the design group. One of her colleagues saw it, says, great job. Now, what's really interesting is if you look under every single post in Yammer, we have the share button. And what the share does is it makes it really easy to take a piece of content in one group and share it out to another group. And a lot of that has to do with making it easy around permissions to do so. So if someone wanted to share this post with, say, the conference design group, they would just click that button. It would bring up a quick share dialog. They would target the conference planning group, post a little piece of information, and then immediately post that post over to a completely different group. So here's flipping over to the conference planning group. Totally different group, different mission. The groups may not even know each other existed. But one person who was aware of both groups was able to make a connection between the groups and share that content over. So now what you have is a new conversation in a new context in the conference planning group, but it references that old conversation. So now the conference planning group could use that banner, for example, in some of what they're doing. And again, this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying making connections that sort of save duplicate work. In addition, you can actually share a share. And we see this all the time in our data where shares will actually go viral. So interesting things in the company can be shared through multiple groups, a dozen or so groups. And these posts and this content actually can go viral through your organization and make everyone aware of what everyone's working on all at the same time, in real time. So you can see sort of a zoom in on what a share looks like. And then we also have what we call the My Feed. So the My Feed, or the top conversations feed, brings together all of the conversations that are being posted in the groups you're in, but actually, even more importantly, it brings together posts from groups you're not in. So if someone's posting something potentially interesting to you in a group you didn't even know existed, or in some other part of the product, your My Feed can actually surface that information to you. And again, that goes back to the idea that if you post to a public group, even though you're addressing it to the group, because the group's public, the permissions are much more open, so we can share that information across outside of that group to anyone who might find it relevant. So zooming in the My Feed. So really what Yammer is, when we think about what social is and what Yammer is and sort of the future direction of where these things are going to go, Yammer is really an open messaging system. It's one where with a privacy model based on the idea of need not to know instead of need to know. If you want to dig a little deeper, actually what that means is it's a messaging system that separates permissions and addressing. So the easiest analogy here is email. Email is what I would call a closed system because it tightly couples permissions and addressing. If I want to send you an email, what I have to do is I go new email, and then I put in the to field, I put your name, and then that message goes off to you. The problem with that is I address the message to you so you receive it, but because permissions and addressing are tightly coupled, you're also the only one that has permission to see it. I can't, for example, send you an email but give permission to these other people to see it unless I actually send it to them too. So it forces you to send and permission the messages together. Distribution lists aren't really a solution for this because all you're really doing is sending a copy of the message to the people on the list at the time. Forwarding doesn't help because forwarding, all you're really doing is creating a copy of the conversation or message, and then addressing it and permissioning it to new people and sending it to them. And you end up with basically forked conversations. I mean, I'm sure everyone who uses email regularly has experienced a situation where you end up in this just mega email thread with 12 different conversations happening. I mean, God forbid there's a file in there, and then that thing gets just 50 versions of that. This is the problem when you're tightly coupling addressing and permission. It requires you to jump through all these hoops to actually get the work done you want to get done. It becomes frustrating, and we just feel like there's a better way. We feel like social networking and using an open messaging system like Yammer is just a fundamental upgrade to communicating in a closed system like email. So to give you a specific example of how this can actually come to play, so this is another group. This is the West Coast sales team here, and there's some people posting about stuff. It's important to note again, the West Coast sales team is a public group. So anyone can find this group. Anyone can post into this group, but it's not necessarily posts to this group aren't necessarily delivered to you if you're not a member of this group. So you can see here in the feed, there's some sales guy. He posted a strategy deck, and he's just sort of sharing what he's working on. But you look what's happening here. There's a few things. So he posted this message to the group. You can see here at the top, it's targeted at the West Coast sales team. But also he's @mentioned two users, Max Stevens and David Tyson. So what he's actually done is he's addressed this message explicitly to two people, Max and David. He's given permissions on the content to the West Coast sales team, but because the West Coast sales team is a public group, he's actually given permission of anyone in the company to see this. So we have this idea actually of soft addressing, where you can address people explicitly by @mentioning, or soft addressing, where you sort of post it to the group, and that's much more of an ambient aware. So it's much more flexible as far as being able to permission and address when you start separating them out. So you can see here, so he posted this message. Is there getting a lot of feedback? And this other person, Mikhail, she says, oh, she finds this interesting. And what she does is she @mentions someone else. So you say, hey, you should take a look at that. I know you guys in the East Coast sales team are working on something similar. And then that person who's not even a member of the group, she's on the East Coast sales team, she can actually see this message because it was @mentioned to her. It'll show up in her inbox or her My Feed. And then she can basically make this connection that someone on the West Coast is doing something similar to the people on the East Coast. And again, save that work. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about openness and connectedness, this type of thing here. And for those of you that have been using Yammer, so just out of curiosity by hands, how many people have used Yammer or are using Yammer? Okay, so most. So for those of you that have been using Yammer for a while, this is actually pretty mundane. This is what happens all the time, and you see it. But actually, when you stop and think about what this is, it's pretty amazing. It's someone sort of addressing and sharing what they're working on to a wider group, someone else seeing that and like socially routing that to another person who's not even a member of that group who could save them that time, and then that person being able to easily join the conversation, make that connection, and see that data. I mean, you think about trying to do that in a system like email, you all of a sudden start to see all the forked forwards and file attachments going around, and it becomes a big mess. Whereas this is all one sort of seamless conversation where everyone's brought together. And that idea of social routing, being able to post a message and then have someone else route it for you. That's really what an @mention provides. You see this all the time where someone will ask a question, and then they won't know who the answer is, but someone will answer them. They won't know the answer, but they'll know who has the answer. So what they do is they @mention the person who has the answer, bring them into the conversation, and then they get their answers. So this is why these open systems with more flexible addressing end up being much more powerful than more of a closed system, again, where you have to target every single message to the person. So really, the power of something like Yammer, the power of social in general, is it lets you have those conversations you otherwise wouldn't have had. Because those conversations just aren't possible with the existing tools, communication tools that people have. And we would argue that these conversations actually always end up being the most useful conversations, because they're not constrained by the established communication channels that you already have set up. I have a team who works on this stuff with me. I know how to communicate directly with those people if I need to find out some information, ask a question. But the problem is what if I need to communicate with the sales team or the marketing team? And I don't know those people as well, and I don't know the internals of them. So it's harder for me to communicate with them. So these cross-silo conversations end up being the most valuable. They're the ones that spark new ideas, eliminate the duplicate work that's happening in all organizations where one team is doing the exact same thing as another team, and if only they knew each other existed. And then generally making people feel like they're more connected to the organization and seeing what other people are doing. That's very valuable. So what are we building to sort of bring this to fruition? So the biggest piece that Yammer and SharePoint are going to be working on jointly around the idea of social is a discovery, right? Once we sort of built the groundwork of the open messaging system and allow all this content to be created that is more open and can be more widely shared, the next problem is, okay, well, now you have too much noise. There's just too much stuff flying around the system. How do we get people to discover the right information at the right time they need to make these connections to do their job? So we're going to be investing a lot of work into features around this idea of discovery, of being able to surface relevant conversations, files, people, groups, all of the things that you need to do to make those connections. So specifically, some of the features on the Yammer side that we're releasing now, and everything we're talking about on Yammer is sort of also on the roadmap of SharePoint. I know there's a bit of a situation right now where there's two separate feeds, but it's all going to come together. So things we're working on both sides will be used to eventually power the joint product. So the things we'll be working on as far as the next couple months will be putting a lot more investments into our algorithms to suggest what groups you should join. So groups on Yammer are very powerful, but you have to be able to find the groups to be able to see the conversations that are going on in that group. So recommending groups that you join, groups you're participating in, files, trending files. So all of this great content is being created across an organization. I mean, you take an event like this, SharePoint conference, there were all kinds of PowerPoint decks and things flying around the office. As people were working on their presentations, you have to bring in all kinds of people to put together a presentation like this. It's really helpful to do it on a system like Yammer, where everything's sort of done in the open. You end up actually seeing a lot of content is duplicated over the sessions. So using that type of system to plan even an event like this is very helpful. So you see, if you look at our Yammer network right now, all the trending files were a SharePoint conference talks. You can kind of see what people are working on, what people are doing. It's really nice. And then suggested people. So that's basically just being able to surface to you other people in your organization that you should be connected to. Whether you've been interacting with them and you don't know it, or you're working on similar things in different parts of the organization, and it would be good for you to connect. Being able to surface those suggestions to you to make those connections. We're going to put a lot more work into what we call our top conversations feed. So that's our algorithmic feed that surfaces messages to you. So recently, up until now, we've been really focused on sort of aggregating all of the conversations of the groups that you're in and the people that you're following. But we found that a lot of the more important and interesting conversations are actually in groups that you're not in and occurring with people you're not following. So being able to intelligently identify the conversations and content where you have not made an explicit connection. The follow button's great, but the reality is most users don't do a lot of following. Right? They're not going through and following tons of people or following tons of files. They may follow one or two things that are interesting to them, but there's a lot more that's interesting to them. So what we want to do is we want to take a lot of the sort of ambient sharing that's happening. So you just participating in a conversation with someone, or you just viewing a file, taking all those relationships and taking that into account when we surface what's relevant to you. And then also surfacing real-time recent activity. So we want to start doing this more and more where other people are doing things in the system, and also outside of the system. We'll talk about sort of the platform stuff in a little bit. We can surface to you all the activity that your coworker is doing in real time. So again, this can make that one connection, spark that thing where you see someone working on a particular file right now, or they're editing that PowerPoint, or they're updating that record in Dynamics CRM, and that sort of initiates you to do something you otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. So that was the discovery part. The next part that we're going to be working on together moving forward is the inbox. So if you think of Yammer as sort of this new, and social as this new open messaging system, you need a place for all the messages that are sort of directed to you and the active conversations you're participating in to go. And that's really what the inbox is all about. So we look at if you think of it sort of in terms of product, the discovery part is really more like the home page, where the first thing you see, and it sort of shows you all the relevant stuff that's happening across your company. It's not things that may be directly targeted to you, but it's stuff the system thinks you might find interesting to make a connection. Whereas the inbox, on the other hand, is much more, this is where you get your work done. Right? Today, everyone has an inbox. It's their email inbox, right? Hopefully you're using Outlook. And what that is it's in principle, it should be all the messages and conversations and emails that were explicitly addressed to you, or that you are or conversations that you're participating in. And that's how we view the inbox rules. So just getting those very active conversations into one place with a different style of workflow. So this is the Yammer inbox. And over the course of the next year, we're going to be sort of coming together with the fact that there's two inboxes. You have your email inbox and your Yammer inbox. Again, those products will start to merge over time. But fundamentally, the inbox is actually really just about the workflow. Right? You think of most people think of social as feeds, where they just sort of ambiently scan the feeds. What you're looking at here is actually a feed. It's a message feed. So each one of these messages is a thread. The top one is what we call the thread starter. If you were to drill into one of these, it would look just like a feed. So the formatting of an email versus the way email is formatted versus the way sort of social messages are formatted, that's just UI. Right? Fundamentally, it's a bunch of conversations sort of strung together. But we think when you're in inbox mode, what's important is the workflow. The fact that you can individually mark things as read unread. Being able to separate the sort of read unread there, removing things from your inbox, starring them, putting a lot of that email-style workflow that people are comfortable with. I mean, ultimately what we want to do is we want to take the more open messaging system that we're building and put it underneath the existing email workflow that people are used to. Because it's not really the UI of email or the workflow that's the problem. It's the closedness of it that actually makes it challenging to use. The fact that you can't do certain things like address no one or address everyone, or be able to send a message to different groups of people with different permission levels, or soft addressing, things like that are really the sort of problem with email. Because most people use email as their task list, right? The things in your email inbox are the things you need to do right now, and there's that counter, and it's sort of always screaming at you. And it's very presumptuous that anyone in the world that knows your email address can just insert stuff into your task list. And so these are a lot of the sort of problems with email that we're looking to address with a more open system, where you as the recipient have a little more control as well, rather than anyone can just sort of address you explicitly by your email address. So to recap, the two main things that the Yammer team is going to be focused on, probably over the next year, is the discovery. So taking all the content that's being created with the more open system, and being able to surface that so people that can discover it and make connections, and working on our open messaging system that will hopefully power across all the different parts of Office. So we want to make sure that, for example, a unified compose, where when you go to send a message from anywhere, it's no matter if you're in a document or in your email or in Yammer or in a team site, all of that should be a similar experience. So working together on this open messaging system to sort of tie a lot of the underlying products and features together. So we talked about how the traditional org structure is siloed. So I just want to talk about a few more silos to sort of reinforce that really what Yammer fundamentally is focused on is cross-silo communication. And that's really what social is all about. So if the org structure is a silo, individual functional teams can also be silo. I mean, if you think about and this is very common where if a team's going to go do a project, they'll usually just sort of coordinate over email, especially if it's a small project, and they'll swap files. And the problem is sort of once that project is done, all that institutional knowledge is locked up inside each individual's inbox. No one else saw what was going on, and it's just not a great way for teams to actually work together. But we think Yammer groups, as you saw, are a great way for teams to work together. It helps break down a lot of those silos. Other people can easily come in and out of the conversation. And then you have the whole sort of conversation history as institutional knowledge that other people can find and search later on. But as I said, one problem with groups is that they're hard to find. So we're releasing a few features. The first one is suggested groups, the ability to surface and easily join groups that might be of interest to you. And then, working on things to make it just, again, much more easy to find and discover the groups that are happening that you should be participating in. And then another feature I think is really interesting is this what we call Universal Publisher. And this is a direction we want to take in addition to with Yammer, but across all of the other integrations we're doing, where you'll be able to essentially post a message and be able to address different things right from here, right from the one bar. So you can see here, I'm just posting a message, and I'm addressing it to the sales team, which is a group, the marketing team, which is a group, and then Jim Patterson, which is a person. So being able to basically have a unified address bar where you can target things to any number of people, groups. And groups could be team sites, groups could be distribution lists. It's really just a much more flexible addressing system. Even the ability to address specific objects. So for example, being able to address a file, and then anyone who's following that file or who have interacted with that file could potentially see this message. So looking at just a much more flexible and powerful publisher. And again, bringing this across all of the different apps that you're using. So not just when you're using Yammer, but also from SharePoint, from Outlook. Just being able to single compose window from wherever you are to quickly send a message to post to multiple groups or people. So another silo we think exists in organization are the business apps, right? So most people do all of their work in some sort of specialized apps. If you think about if you're in sales, you spend most of your day in your CRM app. If you're in finance or HR, you spend a lot of your time in ERP. There's customer service, content management. The most important data in your organization actually ends up locked away in one of these specialized business apps. And it's very hard for, if you're using, say, Dynamics as your CRM, and then something like Zendesk as your customer service, those things actually don't integrate very well, and the data ends up locked, and it's sort of the same situation you have with other closed systems, where the people working in one don't know what's going on with another. So a couple weeks ago, we launched 2 key features that really help people work across, was really designed to help people work across business apps. So the first one we launched is what we call Pages. And what Pages is it allows any piece of data, any piece of business data, to have a profile on Yammer. So if you see here what you're looking at, so this is actually a record from Dynamics CRM for the Contoso Ltd company. And this record actually exists in Dynamics, but because this particular network hooked up Dynamics integration, that record can have its own profile page on Yammer. And if you look, it's just like a profile page for a person, right? It has all the conversations that record has been referenced in. It shows a real-time recent activity feed, so you can see real-time what changes people are making to the record, not just in Yammer, but also within the app itself. You can see related content, so any other content in the system that's in or outside of Dynamics can also be related to this. So for example, here's a PDF, a note, and then a TripIt connection from another app that actually can be related to this thing. You can see each one has a list of followers. So this is really just allows the ability for every piece of data in your company to have its own profile page on Yammer that brings together all of the conversations and activity about that object. So if you flip over to actually the page inside Dynamics CRM itself, so remember, so this is Yammer, this is Dynamics. It's the same record, but in 2 different apps. So you can see, this has a follow button in the upper left-hand corner. That's actually powered by Yammer. So if you follow this record in Dynamics, it updates the following list over here on the page itself. You can actually see the conversation. So if you look, you can embed that conversation right in the Dynamics record itself, and they're the same conversation. So if someone were to post a message from Yammer about this record, that would actually show up in Dynamics, whether or not the original poster even had a Dynamics account. And what's really useful is a salesperson, because they're spending most of their time working in Dynamics, they can just ask a question right from this embedded Yammer feed. They can @mention anyone, again, whether they're on Dynamics or not, and that message will be posted back to the Yammer network itself. It'll show up on that profile page, it'll show up in the feeds of anyone following that record, and then we'll also algorithmically deliver it to other people depending on those ambient connections. So if you can say, for example, ask a question about, from the product development team. Product development team usually doesn't have accounts in the CRM app, so it's hard for that to happen. Normally that have to be sort of an outside channel on email. But then the person, because everyone's together on Yammer, they're able to @mention, say, the head of product. They can see their posts on Yammer, and then they can reply right from there. And it's all synced across both these feeds. So as I said, so every single object, all of the actions are surfaced in our activity ticker. So if you're in CRM updating records, changing, for example, the probability of a deal closing from 90 to 60%, that's actually posted real time in our ticker. Other people can see that, comment on it, start a discussion. So you can see here this ticker's showing activity from 3 different apps, so Dynamics, Zendesk, SharePoint, as well as something happening in Yammer itself. All of these objects are available through the universal search. So if you just search, for example, like a company Contoso, it brings together records in Zendesk, SharePoint, files, and then any records in Dynamics CRM, all type ahead search, instant, right from there. And then the ability, as I mentioned, to @mention a record. So what you have here is someone asking, they want to ask a question about a file, a pitch deck, that actually is in SharePoint. But you're able to @mention that SharePoint record right from Yammer. And so that record, that SharePoint record, remember, has a page. So every data object has its own profile page. And what you're actually doing is just @mentioning that profile page. But what it does is it puts this conversation in that feed on their profile page, and then make sure anyone who's following this particular record, this Contoso pitch deck, also will be notified of this post, as well as Jay Patterson explicitly. So this is what you can get when you sort of separate permissioning and addressing. So with these @mentioning, we're actually addressing independently of permissioning the post. Another silo that most people don't think of that's a silo is language. A lot of companies are multinational, and there's different parts of the organization having conversations in different languages, and that prevents people from sort of making a lot of connections. So we feel that we can, we feel that we can break that silo as well using technology. So a feature that we're going to be releasing soon is the ability to translate messages real-time in line. So for example, here's a post. Someone posted in Japanese. I don't speak Japanese, but because the language isn't my native language, there's now this translate button. Here we're actually doing language detection on the back end so that if there's a post in not your language, we expose this translate button right here. And it's very simple. The way it works is you just click that button, and it will translate the entire thread into your native language. Now, this feature is really interesting because it's actually the first joint feature that we'll be shipping together with something we did with Microsoft. So this uses the Microsoft Machine Translation APIs. So this is a pretty good feature because it's both strategic in the fact that we really like breaking down these silos. We view language as a silo, actually a particularly difficult one to break down. But it also shows how something very simple that when we started working with Microsoft, we sort of looked at a bunch of the teams, and this was something we'd wanted to do for a while, and it was just a really good fit to leverage all of the machine translation technology that they already had to build out this feature. So with that, the spirit of cooperation with Microsoft, I'll turn it back over to Bill to sort of talk about what SharePoint is doing in social.
All right, great, thanks. All right, so thanks. Oh, that was a little loud. Apologies for that. So in terms of the approach, I think the first thing, as I was watching that, the first thing I noticed, I think the very first step in any integration with Microsoft and any new company is you start using Contoso in your demos. And at that point, you really know that they've sort of started to absorb the new world. But really, I think we know that there are a lot of light places where we've started to integrate. There's things that are already shipping that involve integrations. But we have a lot of work to do. And we're going to do a bunch of work around integration, around alignment. And in fact, as I'm here working with all you and having lots of conversations and really sort of enjoying the atmosphere, a lot of our developers are back home working on features around that alignment kind of right this second. And so today, as I'm sort of walking through and talking about what we're going to do in the context of SharePoint, I'm actually not going to spend all that much time talking about the feed and how the SharePoint feed and how SharePoint groups and SharePoint sites work. Because for that, really, the philosophy and the approach is basically the same. So even before the acquisition, the way we looked at the world, the way we sort of saw the value of openness and value of fostering connections, it was all the same. And so from that point of view, we're really sort of continuing on that path, bringing the things together. And we think, and we know, I think, that at this point, the features that end users want, the sort of experiences that end users have gotten used to in terms of their experiences out in consumer social networks and just in general in terms of how they want to interact, that we know that users want those and that are comfortable with them. And so that's great. And at the same time, we want to make sure that we take what we already know on the other side, which is making sure to give people the platform that IT really needs in order to make sure that all of the pieces of that experience sort of work within the environment they have, that's there as well. We want to make sure that we're sort of bringing those two pieces together. So what we are going to talk about in the second part of this presentation, like I said, it's not as much about the feed. There's actually a session this afternoon at 5 that's very much about the SharePoint feed, how it works, how it's talking. So I encourage people to the extent that that's the direction you're going to go, sort of in the short term before we bring things together, that you go attend that session and you can kind of really dive deep into that. But what I wanted to talk about today is much more of the way that we think in terms of features we've already built and in terms of sort of the direction that we're going around how we're taking these basic ideas, the sort of general approach of openness, of connectedness, and bringing that to the rest of the places people do work. And I think what we're talking about there is making sure that we focus this on the places where people get work done. I mean, make no mistake about it, when you think about the feed and you think about groups and you think about sites and those conversations, that is the place people get work done. So we're not sort of setting this up in contrast. It's very much the case that for me personally, over the last few years, my work has really moved over, and the percentage of time I spend in the feed, the percentage of time I spend in groups, kind of having conversations and making connections, all the things that Jim talked about, it's really been a huge shift. But at the same time, I still do a lot of work in other places. I do a lot of work in documents. I do a lot of work in BI. There's a bunch of places where I do the rest of my work. And we want to make sure that we take the sort of really powerful concepts of open and connected and bring that over to the other places. And that's where we think a lot more value is to come over time. And for me personally, that's kind of where my team and I are really going to be spending the next few years. And so the first place really where we think about for us is Office and Word, PowerPoint, and Excel. You know, as someone who sort of works in SharePoint but also does a bunch of work in the clients, that's something that, you know, the ability to work there and do and sort of build features within Word, PowerPoint, and Excel is something that it's incredibly humbling because you're talking about literally hundreds of millions of people using the features you write. And so the beauty of that is that when you do things that have an impact on the software and that have an impact on the people who use the software, that's hundreds of millions of people who are more effective and more productive. So as we can bring all of these ideas, these sort of open and connected ideas into Office, that's something that has a huge impact on all of the users that you have within your company. And so the first feature I want to talk about, and the first sort of place that we've done this is something where we made a pretty fundamental shift within Office this release. And the basic idea is that when you save in Office now, when you hit Control-S or you press the little save icon, or you do anything like that, the default place that that file goes to is the cloud. And that, it sounds relatively simple, and I think in today's era it seems, I think, somewhat basic, but that signals a pretty fundamental transformation. The idea that when you hit S, Control-S, and you get the file up there, it's going someplace where it can start to participate in the ecosystem and sort of in the company. And obviously there's a lot of personal benefits you get from that. When you save it, it's available on multiple devices. We're going to have iPhone apps in various places, so your documents are now available to you everywhere. But at the same time, along with that sort of personal benefit you get, it really sort of signals a larger shift in philosophy, I think. And it signals something that's about where we'll be able to go in the future. And so once you have your document up there, I created this document. This particular document actually is a real one that we built around the sort of way we were going to start to do some of the alignment with Yammer on our side and some of the changes we were going to make to do things. And so I put this document up, sort of just scratched down enough thoughts, and then kind of got it out there and shared it with a few people. And we sort of went through, and then my manager, Jeff, really is very interested in this topic, not surprisingly, sort of how quickly things are going to get going. And once we sort of got that, we shared it with him individually, just a couple of keystrokes and click share. And so once you've done that, once the file's up there, once the content's up there, you can very easily share that out with individuals. But I think really importantly is it's not just about individuals. Oh, sorry, jumped the gun a little bit on that. You can also very easily sort of share things with everyone. So there's a shared with everyone folder where you can place things, and they're just available to everyone in your company. You can also share things, you can just sort of type that in, share it out. So at this point, once you had the document, you really got that shared with a large set of people. And what we've started to see around this is it's not just the sort of experience of putting the document there and sort of getting the immediate people it's addressed to collaborating on it. But once we sort of started it and we got it out in the public, the comments, the threads, the things that spin up around the conversation or around the content we have really start to give us better feedback into what we're doing and more response, and we can sort of interact more directly with everyone around that individual document. The other huge place that people spend a lot of their time sort of working and doing work is in the communication tools. So in Outlook, in Link, and in tools like that. And so that's something where, again, we've done some work in this release to really make sure that we can get the content that's social in there. Because when you make connections, obviously it's great to have connections with people, but what you do if you add a little bit of the context to the connection, in other words, you're able to show a little more about not only the feed conversations that person's had, things they've said both to the world and within the context of a group, if you're able to sort of really bring out the other kind of information you have, whether it's email messages, other types of things like that, then you can more easily deepen the connection and the conversations that you have with that person. And so that's another place where putting the feed information, putting all the content around the person really starts to sort of draw in and deepen the things that you do. And the last thing, if you look on the right side, the idea of the contact card, so wherever you see people, having that ability to reach out to them and have a deeper conversation. My team and I are actually based across the country from Microsoft's headquarters. We're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we spend a lot of time thinking about the best way to have conversations with people. A lot of times, the feed and that the sort of general approach of talking to people that way is great, but sometimes there's no substitute for having a video conference or an IM conversation, kind of getting that immediacy of a discussion as well. And so having that and having that available to you wherever you go in order to sort of have those conversations is a great thing. Another place that we've sort of tried to bring the same philosophy is to search. I mean, search is something that certainly as you came to this conference 5 years ago, it's a real focus, still a real focus. But 5 years ago, search was really much more about what's that piece of content that I need? How do I get that individual document or how do I get that individual item and really understand what's in it and use that as a way to sort of inform me? And I think now, if you look at search, both on the internet and within companies, that's really changing pretty significantly. Because when I search for things, a lot of times I'm not, there's a few big pieces that social helps with search. The first is that idea of conversations and open by default really gets a lot of information sort of out of people's heads and out of places like email where it's really not available and puts it out into the sort of searchable web. So things go from being pretty dark and from being something that's not available to the whole company to really being available for all. So the sort of likelihood of you getting something back, getting a conversation back, getting something that has a pointer, the likelihood's much higher. So social and those kind of experiences really help with search. But the other thing is that a lot of times, for me, my team is really starting to think much more deeply about sort of documents and document conversations and conversations or connections around documents. And as we do that, obviously this is an area that we as a company have been looking at forever. And so if I'm going through and sort of looking for information and doing a bunch of searches, the thing that I'm noticing as I use the new search functionality that we've built is that I get the information, and I get lots of great information, but the thing I'm also getting, and the real emphasis within search now, is I'm getting the people. So when I see not only the documents, but it also really emphasizes the people who've worked on things, either have self-identified through profiles or who are associated with that content. Getting that lets me go and see who those people are, reach out to them, because a lot of times they've been thinking about this, they have a lot more context, and being able to build that relationship is really powerful. So this is an example of that. In this particular case, the user's searching for green planning, and you can see out of this, not only you get, this isn't the sort of the front page of the search, but when you search for things, you get the content, but you also get all the people who might be associated with that content. And then once you see that person, you can kind of hover over them and see a lot more about the other things they do. Who are they? What's the kind of content they're interested in? What kind of things have they produced? And so really right there from within the search experience, you can go and make a much deeper connection from the start. And that really goes everywhere. So now, even when I'm not looking for sort of people within the search experience, people come up. So here on the right, again, the people who are involved with this video, it pops up. And so having that, so finding the information, finding the content, but then really just as importantly, making sure that you loop back and see the individuals who've created it so you can build that connection and deepen that connection. The next place is communities. And so this is a feature within SharePoint that we built this release and invested really heavily in. And this fits in a sort of a slightly different spot than either the sort of company feed experience or in the individual group. It's something that's really much more focused around a particular topic. So for a lot of people, if you think about the people's first sort of experience with social-like experiences on the internet, for a lot of people, that really was about internet forums. And the idea there is you have these sort of conversations, they're threaded, they have topics, and they're sort of more structured than what we see in a lot of the sort of newer public social clients, but also in the newer companies. And so that's something that we invested in this release as well, because we think there's a lot of value in really sort of driving those kind of conversations. I mean, probably a lot of people are familiar with the famous XKCD comic that's about someone's wrong somewhere on the internet and you're unable to sleep until you're able to correct that. And I don't know that we necessarily want to foster exactly that within an intranet, but I think that basic idea of people feeling that sort of commitment within a topic they care about to sort of talk about it, comment about it, and really pull all the information sort of, again, out of their head and take that information and make it available for the company, that's something that Communities is really designed for. And so the basic idea here is we have a set of communities. These are all the forums. They're sort of published out to the broader group. There's a portal that's designed to sort of let everyone see all of the communities that are available to them. It's sort of security trimmed out, so if there are private, again, like just as you talked about in Yammer, there are private and public communities, and so private ones are filtered out from your view, but the public ones are all available in this portal, so you have one place to go to see all of the different communities, the sort of topics of interest that you might care about. And really being able to sort of see that and understand that is great. But the sort of basic experience here is this idea of having a single place where you can see the comments, see the conversations. We brought a lot of the stuff around sort of badging and reputation. And this is, again, really about sort of breaking down the hierarchy and the silos, because in this particular case, it's more about what you know and how much you contribute than about what your role is or what your title is. It's something that really sort of helps to take that and emphasize the degree of contribution. And if you dig into a particular conversation here, you can see that something has been voted the best answer to a particular question. And so having that sort of bubbles that up and really sort of lets you say, okay, this person they had valuable input because of what they said, not necessarily because of who they are. And the other piece that sort of takes this, I think, beyond being a sort of, again, just a sort of a recreation of a forum as it exists today, is that we've spent a lot of time trying to integrate that in with the broader feed. So if you look at things like you can mention from within a community, you're able to, when you follow someone and they have something, for instance, voted a best answer, that'll show up to you in the feed. So you'll learn about new communities that you perhaps didn't know about, that people you're working with are participating in. You really sort of get that sort of integration so that you do have, again, that serendipitous discovery. And so this is all about really encouraging participation, and the way these were designed were about really trying to build up as much participation as possible. And the reason for that is the same thing we were talking about before, that when you're talking about search and really trying to get that information out of people's brains and out of the places where it might not be available to everyone, you want to get that information out into the public so that everyone in the company can benefit from it, not just the people on the email thread or not just the people who happen to go to talk to someone in their office. Getting that out there for all is really the critical part of this, and so that's what we're really focused on here. And the last big area that we wanted to talk about in terms of sort of getting work done and going to where work done and sort of imbuing the philosophy of social into the places work done is tasks. And the thing with tasks is, in a lot of ways, you can sort of think of it as, and I think for me, it's probably a thing I thought of as, in some ways, the least social aspect of my work. That it was about what I did in Outlook, sort of managing the individual things I did, and it was about how I sort of kept track of what I was going to finish or what I was not going to do. But this time around, we really wanted to take that because, again, the same idea of making things visible, making things public, really makes tasks much more effective. And so if we think about how tasks work and having this idea of lightweight task management sites, and this is some of the stuff that Jeff showed in the keynote, this idea that you can take tasks, make them about a group, make them as part of a group, and then start to do things like show when a task is completed or a task is assigned in the field. This is something that we noticed even within the context of our own work, that when I saw that someone was assigned a task, I might be able to help. I might know that there's somebody else who can help them or who's already done that task in the sort of spirit of making sure that there's not duplicative work. So having that sort of surfaced again and sort of pushed out to the broader company really has a huge impact on the way that people do work. And so that's the sort of summary of just a few of the places. I mean, I think Jim started this off a little bit by talking about dynamics. Obviously, for people who are in the sales force, using CRM, that's it. That's where they get their work done. That's kind of their life in a lot of ways. And so having that and having the experience of sort of being able to have the social kind of philosophy and the social approach go there, we think it pays immense dividends. And so we wanted to show you a few more examples and a few more ways that the general approach goes. But over time, and really over the next few months and over the next year or so, you're going to see this kind of pop up everywhere, because this philosophy is what we think will really make us more effective across the board. The other big thing that we wanted to talk about here is just in terms of approach is making sure that we're sort of clear to everyone and that we really we really say that we're focused on making sure that all of this is available everywhere. And that's not just the core feed. That's not just about the groups. That's about all of these experiences. So across Office, we're going and taking this and putting this into all different kinds of places. And this idea of having a touch-friendly design, having not only apps, but making sure that every single bit of the user experience is available to you wherever you go, because you're going to be touching the experience a lot more than you're going to be typing out the experience in most situations. And so having that sort of general approach be everywhere. There's just so much here about making sure that you don't do things like have hover effects is the only way to get to certain experiences, about making sure that hit targets on everything are large enough. We've really spent a lot of time in SharePoint, certainly, and I know in Yammer as well, trying to kind of get ourselves kind of ready for this. And I think it's really showing in the product today, and it's going to continue to be a place where we make major investments over time. So just making sure that we have the sort of basics nailed, and that we be able to not only put the experiences onto apps, but also as we look across the breadth of the experience, that it's also available in HTML5 as well. And so this is about, of course, not just phones, but also tablets. And this is, and I think, again, as Jeff mentioned in the keynote, this is about iOS. This is going to be about Android. This is really about all of the different devices. Like, we know that's the set of things that people use. We hear that loud and clear. And so we're focusing not only on Windows Phone and Windows 8, but we're focusing all the way across all of the platforms. And so in terms of the overall approach, and like I said, the overall philosophy, I mean, this basic idea of being open and making companies overall more open, so this idea of open by default, with the ability to more narrowly scope things if they need to be, but sort of starting from this position of making things open by default and having that drive connections between individuals, that is the philosophy, and that is the approach that we're taking overall. And we really think that that's the place and that's the way that work does get done. We think that that's the way that people are most effective. Like, we've seen it internal to SharePoint in terms of the way we work. Yammer's seen that for a long time in terms of the way they work. And now, as our teams come together, as we were building this presentation together, we had a Yammer group, and we were kind of constantly walking through and sort of making updates to the deck and working through the deck as we went. And that's just the way that we do things now. And I think it's the way that we think that over time, more and more of Office and more of companies are going to be working. And so that's it. So we wanted to make sure to leave a little time for questions at the end, knowing that there'll probably be a few. So.
Hey there.
Hey.
Hello. So relatively new to the social space, but can you kind of get an overview of the use case of when a 2013 community template is the right choice and when a Yammer group is the right choice?
Yeah, there's certainly some guidance that our marketing teams are putting together. I think that actually there's a session, I believe, I'm not sure when it is today, but the community session, I'm pretty sure they're going to be covering that in a reasonable amount. But at a very high level, I mean, I think the real idea here is communities are very much more about sort of topics of interest. And I think the group area and that functionality is much more about a V-team, a conversation that's about a particular project or a particular team, as opposed to a general topic of interest. I think communities was really focused more on that topic area.
Okay, thanks.
Similar question, I think you'll hear a lot of them. What should we be telling customers right now that we're building for right now, which way they go, which feed they choose? We're making decisions that may have impact 6 months, a year down the road, and we're kind of lost of which direction to go.
Yeah, so there was a session yesterday where, again, it was similar, and there was a lot of these questions. And what Jared, so he's the sort of product marketing person for SharePoint, is he said, go with Yammer. And the reason is that they're both going to come together at the same time. But Yammer you can get started today, right now, whereas it would take a little longer probably to get going with 2013. Now, it doesn't matter if you're already sort of in the process of rolling out 2013.
So turn off the news feed in
Go with
2013?
I think the general approach would be pick one or the other, right? And I think the general guidance is pick Yammer to the extent that that fits in with your needs. Start there. But there's a lot of people for whom, if on-prem is a requirement, obviously then Yammer is not an option, right? And so if there's a certain specific set of needs, then go with the SharePoint. But know that no matter, I think the point that we're really trying to emphasize is that, from our team's perspective, we're working hard to bring them together as fast as we can. So whichever one you pick, you'll end up in the same spot, and that's the goal.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not going to leave anyone stranded. If you go 2013, Office 365, or Yammer, those are all the correct decisions. Now it's just a matter of hard requirements, cloud versus not cloud, or the speed at which you want to deploy it. Obviously, Yammer and Office 365 can be deployed usually much quicker than sort of an on-prem SharePoint.
Hi. I saw the pages introduced in Yammer, which I really like. But I was wondering, are they going to be merged with the terms page in SharePoint? Because the terms page in SharePoint seems to me as a very nice starting point for gathering information regarding a particular term as well.
So you're saying in terms of term spaces in SharePoint? I mean, that's not something we haven't gotten to the sort of depth of integration on there. I mean, in general, our approach is to try to bring things together as much as possible, but we haven't really got to the depth of planning around things like that yet.
All right, thanks.
Sorry.
Could you comment on APIs for Yammer, integrating with other products like, for instance, Salesforce?
Yep. Yammer uses the stuff you saw up there where we were sort of putting feeds and dynamics and syndicating objects back and forth. The protocol that uses is called Open Graph protocol. It's the same exact protocol, for example, Facebook uses to do integrations with like Spotify and Yelp. The underlying protocol is based specifically on that. Then there's just sort of REST APIs to do more richer integrations. As far as showing a feed, so taking those Yammer feeds and being able to embed them in other objects. We actually widgetize those, so it's really just sort of like, it's like embedding a YouTube video. You just sort of generate, for every feed on Yammer, you can generate just some HTML JavaScript code that you copy and then paste into another web page, and it will actually render those feeds. And you can render, we have things like the follow button, the like button, the sign in button that we sort of widgetize, that you can easily put those in. But if you want to go down to sort of the raw API level, everything's available there.
Are there plans to integrate Link with Yammer and give that immediate presence?
So the question was, I think, are there plans to merge Link or
Integrate with Link?
Integrate Link? Yes. I mean, the Link Skype integration will definitely happen. It's just a matter of timing on that one. At the moment, we're working on files. So if you say, what are the teams working on right now? We're working on merging the files, really with SkyDrive Pro, where SkyDrive Pro will be the back end for all the files within Yammer. You won't actually upload a file to Yammer anymore. It would be uploading, what you're actually doing is uploading a file to SkyDrive Pro. So that's the first phase of the integration. And then the next phase is sort of up for grabs. It could be Link, but we're also talking with the Outlook and Exchange teams. There's a lot of interesting things around email that are interesting. So we just don't know yet, but it definitely will happen.
Hey, Jim. Quick question around, you said pick one or the other. What's the migration strategy if we pick wrong?
Well, hopefully there won't be a pick wrong. We don't have the mechanics yet of okay, at some point we're ready to bring these two together. You have some content in one, you have some content in other. What does that look like? We don't have the specific plan yet, but the goal would to not leave people stranded, where we're like, oh, sorry, you made the wrong choice. So to do whatever we have to do to make it reasonable that whatever is the long term, the final solution, that all the content you had, if you didn't go with that, sort of ends up together.
Okay, thanks.
But a lot of this stuff, remember, important thing is the value of these messages. It is valuable to sort of have them available in search and that knowledge base, but sort of the real-timeness of these things do diminish over time. So, the messages that are, say, a year old, they're valuable to have, they're valuable to be searchable, but, if they were potentially in some other format or, you couldn't interact with them the same way, that's probably what most likely, the most likely scenario would be, something like that, where there's just sort of older legacy-style conversations that you can't do certain things. Because, as the Yammer feature set improves and you can do more on the messages, it already is the case that there's a slight feature gap between what the SharePoint newsfeed messages are and Yammer messages are. And we want to bring those together, but, the migration strategy is not fully known yet. Especially for on-premise, which will actually be moving slightly, a year behind sort of where SharePoint Online is.
I'm just wondering, are you going to offer any type of migration tool or transition tool from people who are using NewsGator? Bring data in. I mean, the price is right, obviously, for Yammer. So a lot of people who are using NewsGator out there are kind of scratching their heads thinking, all right, how do I transition my data, my communities, my spheres, my, all the things that look extremely similar but now are being offered with this new purchase. Any thoughts to bring that audience on board?
That's not something we've been actively working on as a product team. I mean, I imagine there'll be some partner and other work around that, but that's not something that we've been actively looking at.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question. This is great for behind the firewall. Have you given thought into taking this to, say, the supply chain partners in terms of data security and, say, governance?
Taking it to, sorry?
Have you thought about, can we take this outside the firewall to the supply chain partners of a customer? And have you given thought to the data security issues there?
Yeah, so I think we both are. So for Yammer, we have a feature called External Networks that lets you create a Yammer network where you can invite in people from outside your company to collaborate. So for example, when the Microsoft Yammer merger was happening, before the deal was closed, we were technically two separate companies. Legally, we actually couldn't merge our stuff, so we actually set up an external network for the 3 months while we were in that limbo state, just to sort of start communicating. And we see all the time our customers on the Yammer side create these external networks and invite in all other people from outside their company. I also know SharePoint has similar.
Yeah, and similarly within SharePoint, at a group scope, you can invite in people externally. Certainly with an SPO, if you're on-prem and you want to do that, obviously you need to do work to sort of punch the hole in your firewall to enable that. But for 365, that's just something we support out of the box.
My question was pretty much exactly the same. If you've got an on-prem instantiation of SharePoint, you're using, let's say, Yammer in-house or SharePoint, and you want to maintain that on-prem deployment, but you want to do external collaboration, so you kind of talked loosely to it just now, but could you be more specific about exactly what you would need to do to enable that broader collaboration while retaining the content on-prem?
Sure. Yeah. There's actually there's some sessions that cover this to some extent. So if you come up afterwards, I can look them up for you. But basically, there's a series of things, and we actually did this ourselves within for our own sort of internal dogfooding as we were developing the product, where we did, we sort of set ourselves up with a full internet URL and essentially allowed ourselves to share broadly with people via the. So basically, we effectively punch a hole in the firewall and sort of use a reverse proxy to allow people externally to get in, and then we can create individual users within the sites.
Okay, thanks.
My question is again related to the same security and classification. A lot of financial clients require data to be classified, and what is Yammer's and SharePoint's approach to the classification? Are we building it online? I mean, it's like as part of the out-of-the-box. Are we looking to both from SharePoint as well as from Yammer? Are we looking to include data classification? And also, how does Yammer work with the hybrid environment where organizations have both on-premises and as well as the Office 365 environment and shared services?
It was hard to catch all of that because just people are moving around. But I think, I mean, it sounded like you were generally asking about, to the extent that you have specific needs around, high business impact information and classifying information, how do you ensure that? And I think that's a place where today, I mean, and you can correct me if you're wrong, but that's something where from SharePoint, as we're built on top of the SharePoint platform that supports a lot of those notions, that if those are your needs and those are your specific needs today, using SharePoint for social is probably the right decision for you, because that's something that we focus on, whereas I think right now it's not something that Yammer is focused on. And so we do have a lot of those capabilities because essentially the core way that information is stored is in SharePoint lists, which have a lot of these notions and so forth. So I think that information and that that security is something that's probably more about a SharePoint installation as opposed to a Yammer one.
Okay. And how does it work with the shared environment? I mean, the shared services and the.
I'm sorry. Can you speak up a little bit?
How does it work with the shared services or the hybrid environments?
Hybrid environments. Well, so the hybrid story there are there's a lot of things that will work in a hybrid scenario around things like search and so forth, but we actually don't right now. We don't federate. So if you have, for instance, your personal sites where a lot of the social work happens, if you have that in the cloud and then team sites on-prem, we don't generally do hybrid federation across those two scenarios today. It's something that's on the roadmap, something we're looking at, but it's not something that we support in this version.
Okay. All right, we have time for one more.
Yep. Okay, sure. We have a corp news site where we put, portal pretty much we put news stories maybe 3 times a week for the whole corporation. And we're looking, currently we have NewsGator, we're looking at gatorizing that and putting comments underneath each story and feedback. Do you guys integrate with like web parts that could have comments on individual stories, or you have any thoughts to do that in the future where you can add it to add say feeds to the bottom of news stories? Kind of like CNN Pulse or something like that. Where you get a.
So you mean like sort of the comment feed at the bottom of
comment
of
feed,
a page?
you like it, you vote.
Yeah,
on it,
so
popular.
that's basically our. You saw how you can embed a Yammer feed anywhere.
So,
So what you would do is that particular page on SharePoint would be a page on Yammer, and then you'd embed that feed right onto that page. So all the discussions would carry the context of that page. It would appear in the object feed that lives on that profile, and then people could follow whatever that thing is. So an example is a lot of people use this for internal blog comments. So if you have an internal blog, we're releasing a WordPress plugin, for example, where you can just swap out the commenting system that's built in with a Yammer commenting system. So it sort of syndicates that back to the Yammer network and drives a lot more traffic to that blog post. All right, well, thanks for everyone for coming. If you have any additional questions, we will